This week on Personally Speaking, our guest is Christopher White, a longtime writer and correspondent who covered the Vatican for many years under Pope Francis. And he's our guest. He's written a great new book called Pope Leo XIV. Please stay with us. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Monsignor Jim Lisante, and Christopher White joins me now. Chris is an associate director and senior fellow at Georgetown University's Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. Until recently, he was the Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter, and his award-winning coverage took him to more than 24 countries with Pope Francis. The election of Pope Leo XIV, the first North American to ascend to the chair of St. Peter, marks a significant moment in the life of the Catholic Church. Just 6 weeks after the election of the new Pope, NBC Vatican correspondent Christopher White has written a book about the pontiff titled Pope Leo XIV. The subtitle says, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy. This book offers a compelling introduction to Pope Leo and is a timely and accessible guide to understanding the new pontiff, his pastoral priorities, his experiences and convictions that will shape his approach to the papacy. Christopher White also gives us a detailed account of the conclave, the key figures involved, and the decisive moments that shaped the election of Pope Leo XIV. Chris White is here with us today to tell us how Leo became Pope, to give us an insight into Pope Leo XIV's priorities and the potential impact on the Church. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking, the writer of a great new book on Pope Leo, Vatican correspondent and author Christopher White. Christopher White is our guest today. The book is called Pope Leo XIV, and the subtitles are important. Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy. Chris, thanks so much for coming on Personally Speaking.
It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Chris, I got to ask you, I'm always intrigued by the origin of the people we have on the program. Where do you come from, and what kind of family formed and shaped you? And when you look back on what they did for you right, what did your family do right in raising you?
Oh gosh, that's a loaded question. Born in South Carolina,
Okay.
but moved to New York about 20 years ago for school. So yeah, exactly 20 years ago, I moved here in 2005,
Yeah.
and raised, my parents and one sister, tight-knit family in the South. They would say good Southern values,
Okay, good.
and very fearful of what the big city would do to me. But it's been nothing but I think just a real joy to be in New York 20 years. But I think I can't
Yeah.
understand myself without my roots and deeply rooted in family and faith and everything that goes with that, and that still I carry with me. They might have a different answer what they did right and where I've gone wrong, but that's my answer.
And I like it. It's a good blend, the South as well as New York City. And let me ask you this, a question I get all the time. I guess every guy in my business does. When you become a priest, why journalism for you, Chris?
Total accident. So I had gone to graduate school at Fordham
Hmm.
and studied ethics, and wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do after that. I thought maybe I'd go on to continue further studies, do a PhD, perhaps teach. But I knew after I finished my master's work that what I enjoyed most was writing. And that was 2013, and it just happened to coincide with the election of Pope Francis. I thought that was just a great story, and I was hugely interested in it. And so I started doing freelance work, and one thing led to another, and it became my full-time work. And it's just been just a pretty heady path since then, to go from 2013, watching him be elected over the course of my spring break at Fordham to then covering a conclave to watch his successor be elected from a balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square in real time. Pretty difficult to absorb, but it's a total privilege as well.
Yeah, what a great gift. What a grace for you. Let me ask you too, because you say at one point in the book, and I'm intrigued by it. Every day I try, well, I do. I read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post and all the other papers. I mention it because you say at one point, I've tried determinedly not to let my personal points of view or my bias get into my reporting.
Yeah.
And yet I take my red pen and I see, I think without meaning to, a lot of people in journalism do. How do
Sure.
you separate out things you believe in deeply from objective reporting?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult balancing act, and I certainly don't always get it right. I do think, one thing that's been important to me is to, stay inquisitive and to talk to as many people as possible. And so, one of the stories I often like to tell is, I, spent 4 years living in Rome, covering the Vatican day in and day out. And that's a tough job in many respects because you're trying to sort of get to the heart of what's happening in a fairly closed off, insular institution. And one of the things that I certainly write about in the book, and I've certainly talked about openly, is if people have strong opinions about your paper, whether or not you are representative of every single thing that the paper publishes or not, it's hard sometimes to separate that out. And I often tell the story of this one bishop in the Vatican who I would take to lunch a lot. And he would always say, I hate your paper, I hate your paper, I hate your paper. I think you're fair, and I'll always go to lunch with you because I love the fact that I make your paper pay for lunch.
Okay, eat up there, Bishop.
Exactly, exactly.
Wow. And you have to, I would imagine, talk to people from every dimension of the church. What I love, for those who are wondering, how can someone so quickly write a book about Pope Leo? It's certainly about Pope Leo and anticipating what might happen in his papacy, but there's also a lot of Francis in there and
Sure.
some of the other background. Um, I guess one of the things I'm troubled by, Chris, you're so young, but I'm old enough to remember the moment when John the 23rd was
Oh
elected
gosh.
Pope. Yeah, yeah. And I remember as a kid looking at a picture of Pius and thinking, so austere, no joy. And then seeing this roly-poly, delightful, beautiful man come. And I literally, when he died, wept because I thought we had lost like a grandpa figure. In the
Sure.
same way, I have loved Francis,
Yeah.
but I've been troubled by the level of criticism against him. Why, especially since he died, do people feel free to go after a guy who I think accomplished great good?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, to start with, it's fair to say one of the things I witnessed in real time covering his final months and then his death was just the outpouring of love from every corner of the globe, and from people from all political backgrounds, all theological backgrounds. This was a pope that was very much loved,
Yeah.
and I think there's no denying that. I think the criticism, in a sense, is probably more stronger felt in our country than
Hmm.
elsewhere, because I think the critics tend to have a bigger megaphone
Yeah.
that often makes them appear louder than they actually are. Because what I witnessed in traveling the globe with Francis, to people of all different stripes and persuasions, saw in him a real sort of just example of the very best of humanity and something that they wanted to emulate in their own lives.
Yeah. Christopher White is our guest. His book is called Pope Leo the 14th. I got the number right. I wanted to ask you too, because it's intriguing to me. You have had a privilege, Chris, that very, very few of us have had an opportunity before he became Pope to interview Pope Leo. I'm not interested so much in particular issues, but you're an old time interviewer of lots of people, bishops, cardinals, all the rest. When you walked out of the room after having an interview with him, Robert Prevost, what was your impression of him as a man?
I thought two things I'll say. One, it was the journalistic side of me was hoping maybe he would disclose more. He definitely kept his cards close to his chest.
Yeah.
But that in turn left to my other opinion is that this is a serious man who does his homework
Mhm.
and really is a great study and student of people and humanity. And I went in there with my list of questions that I wanted to ask him, and I was amazed at how quickly he turned the conversation and began to ask me questions.
Wow.
And that is something that it was really insightful, and it is sort of held up in all the conversations I've had with those that have known him much longer than I have,
Yeah.
that this is just his disposition. He's someone who is sort of fundamental to his style of leadership, thinks that he has to do all his homework, and to find out as much as he can before he weighs in on big decisions. And I think that's part of the reason why he was elected, in fact, is because they saw in him a very disciplined, careful manager, and they wanted someone who could manage well. After 12 years of reform that Francis has initiated, how can we move this to the next phase? And I think that was the critical key in understanding why they looked to him.
Christopher White is our guest. The book is Pope Leo XIV. This is now our second Pope, Chris, that's from a religious community.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, because we usually had our popes from diocesan ministry and the political world that comes with that, what is the significance of electing someone who's from a religious order? Does that matter?
Oh, I think absolutely it does. I mean, by virtue of the fact that he was an Augustinian, he's so rooted in communal life, and I think that will weigh heavily in the way he governs. Everything is done as a community. Obviously, someone has to take the decision at the end, but there's broad consultation, and I think he'll bring that style to leadership in the church more broadly. But the other thing I'd say is, this is someone who is part of an order. He was the head of the order for 10 years. That operates in 50 countries around the world. So his horizons are global. They are that of a missionary who was, of course, born in this country, but spent a third of his life in Peru and a third of his life in Italy. And I don't think you can untangle any of that. I think it all comes together in one package. And at the heart of that is the fact that he has that background because he chose this path as a religious, as an Augustinian. And that really sort of helped him see what it was like to live as a priest, as a missionary from the ground up.
Now, this may sound like a strange question coupled with that, but for a long, long time, guys in religious orders were never considered to be papal candidates. And I mention that because of that, I would suspect that Francis and Robert Prevost lived their whole life thinking, I'm never going to be Pope. That's okay.
Yeah.
But now I'm just wondering, when you come into this work without the kind of overwhelming ambition to be Pope,
Yeah.
are they humble men?
Yeah, I mean, I have said that I think Prevost may be the most humble pope in the last 100 years, because I think part of the reason why he was really attractive to his brothers as a possible candidate was because of that humility.
Mm.
Humility. It was just so obvious he didn't want the job, and I think he thought, not only do I come in this as a religious, I'm an American, and historically has just been a real strike against people because the general thinking has been America has too much power in the world. There's no way we're going to sort of give this superpower, the papacy and the U.S. presidency, one country too much. Basta, basta, basta. No, no, no. And in this case, yes, he was born in the U.S., but they saw him as someone who bridged various continents, and that became a plus rather than a strike against him.
Christopher White's our guest. This book is called Pope Leo XIV, one of the first books out on the Pope. This is an interesting thing to me to get into this about celibacy, but recently I brought it up a bunch of times on this program. George Weigel, happily married, said, no, celibacy forever. Priests must be celibate. So there's Dr. George Weigel from his position as a married man. But then Cardinal Ouellet was our guest a few weeks ago, former head of this congregation that makes bishops, and he said it's a discipline. It can change, which surprised me, the looseness with which he talked about it. So are you thinking, especially in light of Western Europe and America and the lack of vocations in many places, any sense at all about Pope Leo and his willingness to at least examine the possibility, like our Orthodox friends, of a celibate priesthood and a married priesthood?
Yeah, I think I think he recognizes that tectonic plates are shifting in the world, and that obviously has serious repercussions for the church. He hasn't weighed in on this question specifically, except in encouraging priests to keep their vow of celibacy. That is not saying that he is committed to celibacy as being the only way forward. And certainly one of the things that, the Amazon Synod in 2019 opened up this question, and there's just a real recognition that there are parts of the world where there's a dire priest shortage, and that married priests could be a real solution. Francis himself was open to this, and Francis seemed to want to give way for if bishops' conferences saw a need, they could come to the Vatican and make that specific request. And I think that is certainly this a similar path and space that Leo will operate in. It will be very interesting because, and quite frankly, we know the need is there. We see it in places like the Amazon, where there's just, people go months, sometimes years, without being visited by a priest, and yet they have, married men that could serve in this capacity, and that are willing to do so. And so, it's I think it's important to note that this is not some long held, doctrine of the church. It's simply a matter of discipline.
Christopher White, so I guess, Chris, as someone who's written for the National Catholic Reporter, when I was back as director of the Christophers, the column I wrote would get into 300 newspapers every week. I'm guessing, because that was back around 2003, 2004, I'm guessing there are far fewer outlets in the Catholic press. Um, what do you see for the future of getting our message out effectively if the instruments for that don't seem to be growing?
Sure, it's tough, and one of the reasons Leo took the name Leo, I think, is because he recognized in the way that Leo XIII did that the world is evolving and the church has to evolve with it. And Leo XIII, of course, was concerned about questions of the rights of workers, and that gave birth to modern Catholic social teaching. Leo XIV seems to be interested in technology quite a bit. And so I think, one of the ways in which the church is going to have to adapt is in the digital sphere. So like, you and I are speaking right now and in this format, that is an evolution that, for Catholic media. And I think that will continue to have to evolve. You'll see more shifts to online digital media platforms such as this.
Mhm.
And that's a good thing. It's because it's a space where people are, and in a sense, that's why you've seen under Pope Francis this talk of digital missionaries. Well, this is a digital space that is being sort of explored for the first time, and clearly the church has been behind, but I think there's some catch up that is being done and should be done.
Christopher White, so I guess the book is Pope Leo XIV. Let's talk a little bit about division.
Yeah.
You've worked for the National Catholic Reporter, and I find a column online recently in Crisis magazine saying, we think maybe the National Catholic Reporter is in financial trouble. We should perhaps be happy about that because they don't represent our point of view. Troubling to see that in the Catholic press, people shooting at each other at any time.
Yeah.
But what do we do? I mean, you've tried to be fair and balanced, pardon the expression, and you've tried to build bridges. What are we supposed to do to get these two ridiculous extreme elements of the church to mutually respect each other? One of the things in the column there was that, that they've promoted people who are pro-choice, pro-abortion. I don't read the Catholic Reporter as that way at all. I think nobody wants abortion, but we're living in a culture that clearly says they want medical access if needed. So you have a strange conflict going on there. But my point is, you deal with people from both sides of the Catholic press. How do you bring people together?
Pope Francis was really wonderful, and in the late stages of his papacy, he had this expression that he used a lot, that the church should be open to everyone, todos, 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 tutti, 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 everyone, everyone, everyone. And at the heart of that is that there should be room for everyone, regardless of their background, based on the fact of their God-given human dignity. And it was really interesting the night of Leo's election that he didn't repeat that exact phrase, but he said a missionary church open to all, which I think is his version of that todos, todos, todos. And so I think the key is perhaps sort of getting back to this notion of the church as expansive with arms open rather than this sort of gatekeeper. And I think, one real flaw has been in recent decades, this attempt to sort of see the sort of the disposition by many, especially in this country, to sort of see the role as church just to be that of a guardian, a gatekeeper to keep people out. And I think perhaps if that other vision could take over, it would be far more attractive. And I think it's far more reflective of what's in the gospel.
You know the book. It's called Jesus Wept by Phil Sheenan. And I mentioned that because he had been a guest on our program. I don't like lots of parts of the book. I think it's massively unfair to Pius XII, not others. But I mentioned that because he said at one point, and I was sad to hear it, he said, there aren't too many outlets in the Catholic world that will even talk to me because the book is critical of our popes. What's your point of view? Should we be talking to the enemy more often? Is dialogue a thing you see opening up more freely in the church now under Leo?
Yeah, I think so. I think Francis certainly started a trend. There was a time in the, let's say, particularly the 80s into the 90s where those, you think of the academics, the priests that dared to say we can ask questions. They were silenced. They were shunned. Francis did away with all of that, and I think that makes for a much healthier institution. An institution that is confident shouldn't be afraid of questioning.
Right, okay.
And there should be space for that. So absolutely, I think everything should be on the table. There should be space for those that disagree, that have strong opinions, because I think that's a sign of an institution that can handle doubt, because doubt gives way to faith.
Okay, our guest is Christopher White. His book, which I hope our listeners and viewers will get, is great stuff. It's called Pope Leo XIV. Now, I want to follow up on something you just said because I'm intrigued by it. So, that openness to other points of view that Pope Francis certainly lived, and I think Pope Leo seems to be promising to live. Let's go through a specific example. I guess I'm amazed coming out of the time of John Paul, where people under Ratzinger could be curtailed and silenced, that you have a guy like Cardinal Mueller or Cardinal Burke or a guy we've had on the show, Cardinal George Pell, who could be so critical of Francis, and they're still standing, except for George, who's in heaven. But he allowed them and did not remove them. And then there are other examples. I'm thinking of that bishop from Tyler, Texas, or a priest I knew from New York, Father Frank Pavone, who do get clipped. So I'm just wondering, do you have any insight into what made Francis make the decisions he did prudentially on who can keep talking and who's not allowed to talk anymore?
Well, the way he explained his thought process on this was he said, look, Pell and I had serious disagreements, but they happened face to face.
Ah,
And I think his big sort of concern was that he felt those that were trying to undermine him, that didn't have the courage to do it to his face, that were trying to fuel sort of underground movements, resistance, rather than doing it all out in the open. Now, I think sometimes he just got it wrong as well. I think there were others that for example, I think, what happened in Tyler certainly went on for far too long. And that, it wasn't just about the fact that Strickland, the bishop down there, was questioning the Pope and calling him a heretic, but he was also at the same time letting his diocese fall into disrepair and was incapable of managing it. So I think there were legitimate reasons to remove him beyond just the fact that he was calling the Pope a heretic. But I think for Francis, he wanted there to be space to disagreement, but he wanted it to happen face to face.
now, you know, and I know that Pope Francis talking about saying things that might be critical or harsh, that he's said some pretty harsh things when it came to President Trump. Do you see a different style in Pope Leo in terms of how he might, if he has to, confront an American president or a Putin, how he would do it stylistically?
Yeah, Francis spoke off the cuff. That's why we reporters loved him. It's why it's paid top dollar to sit on the papal plane, because you never knew what he was going to say or do,
Right.
and that was the best way to capture it. Leo is a very different personality. Francis was an extrovert that fed off the energy of the crowds, that felt tremendous freedom in environments like that, which allowed him to speak his mind and then sometimes apologize later if he needed to. But he just spoke off the cuff, and it was wonderfully exciting and nerve-wracking. Leo's just his temperament is wildly different. He's an introvert. He will speak almost like a trained diplomat. He will think
Mm.
through what he says. And so, in many respects, I think he may be to use it strongly, to put it strongly, I don't mean this negatively. He may be more boring for some people because he will be cautious, but that in effect may allow him to actually get more done.
You know, it's interesting. When he was leaving Peru and moving to Rome, we had written him saying, "Would you come on personally speaking?" And he wrote back saying, "Sure, I'd love to. Let me get settled first in Rome." And we've kidded saying, "Well, now he owes us an interview." But
Absolutely.
but I think you may be right that he will be far more cautious about giving interviews, which makes your interview with him even more interesting. Final question, I promise. Christopher White's our guest. The book is called Pope Leo XIV. You watch a lot of stuff going on in the world. You see the divisions, you see the wars, you see the terrible things that are going on. You see in the church the divisions that are very troubling sometimes in the name of Christ. I ask you that because both as a person, a believer, a reporter, a writer, What keeps hope alive in you, Christopher White?
Oh, that's a loaded question, isn't it? I have to say, for all of its exhaustion, the conclave itself was amazing because, for 48 hours, you had people all around the world not knowing who was going to appear on that balcony. And they had flags from their respective countries, and they didn't know each other. They didn't speak the same language, but there was a sense of unity that whoever walked out on that balcony was going to be someone that they believed in, that they hoped in. And to me, that was very faith affirming. It was joyful. It was the very best of humanity, and just such a counter witness to those who want to build walls, to those who want to erect barriers, to say that no, there's a better way possible. And so that was certainly life-giving, sustaining, hopeful, and that's what I'll draw from for some time.
Many journalist friends of mine over the years, I'm thinking of a guy like Bob Keeler, who won the Pulitzer. Uh, I don't know why, but they do tend to be a jaded and slightly cynical crowd, and you don't seem to be that, Chris.
Maybe I'm just on a high after the last few months. Talk to me in a few months, and I'll give you a different tune. But for now, I think there's reason to leave cynicism at the door.
Reason to hope. Okay. Christopher White has been our guest. His book is Pope Leo XIV. I hope our listeners and watchers will get it. We're all wondering about this new guy in town, Pope Leo, and I think he gives great insight into where he may go. But importantly, it also does a wonderful dissection, I guess, of the pontificate of Pope Francis, who we should still study and reflect on because he had such a monumental effect on our church. Chris, you write so well. You're highly readable. I went through this book in like one night because I couldn't put it down. That's a great gift to have as a journalist, to have the facts, but also have the ability to communicate so effectively. You're really good, and you're a positive guy, and you do try to do, and you succeed, I think, in not allowing personal bias to get in the way of your reporting. So keep on doing that for us, and thank you for writing Leo XIV.
Thank you so much. A real pleasure.
Thanks for being with us on Personally Speaking. If you need to reach me, you can do that at personallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. You've probably been listening to this program on the Catholic channel on Sirius XM. You can also watch it on YouTube, searching under Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante. We're also on catholictv.org. You can see us on Facebook at Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante and on Instagram at Personally Speaking Podcast. I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer, Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Jandovitz. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.